الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وزوجاته أمهات المؤمنين وصحابته رضوان الله تعالى عنهم أجمعين. Well, on behalf of the Al-Furqan, the Islamic Heritage Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to the first lecture we have in the year 2001. And it's a good omen, and we are so proud that we start with the first lady we have in our field, the one we are so grateful to what she does really, not only for Al-Furqan, but for the Islamic heritage. The one who wrote more than 106 books so far about Islamic culture, history, literature, and so on. And of course, it's her third lecture in our series of lectures we have. The first one was on Iqbal, the famous philosopher and poet in our Islamic history, and he just passed away last century, about this creative love in his poetry. The second one was geography in poetry. And this one is really very interesting and important. It's about animals. And we, as Muslims, look at animals in a special way. They are mentioned in the Quran, mentioned in the Sunnah, i.e. the sayings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in Islamic literature, poetry, it's mentioned quite a lot. We hear nowadays about human rights. In Islam and so many jurists, they're speaking about animal rights. Because according to the teachings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you are good to animals, you go to heaven. And if you treat them badly, you go to hell. And animals mean so much to me as a person, as a Muslim, and I'm sure to so many of you. When I was a young boy, one of the most beautiful books I read is Kalila and Dimna. And sometimes I feel that I can talk to animals, I can reciprocate with them. I was raised this way. And we are privileged, really, and honored to have the great scholar, Professor Annemarie Schimmel, to speak to us today about this interesting subject for the Muslims. I cannot introduce her to you. She's number one. And sometimes I feel that she is really controlled by a super power who can help her in her work. And I'm honored to be a friend. And I'm honored to introduce her tonight. I know that sometimes when she talks, I say, I wish she doesn't stop. And I asked her last night if she's going to talk for how long. She said, no, this time I will speak longer, so I won't worry so much. Our great lady, great scholar, Professor Annemarie Schimmel, please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, should I not use an example as I like as God gives us an example of life by mentioning the gnat. This is a verse from our great German poet Goethe in his Westöstlicher Divan. He refers, of course, to the mentioning of the order in Surah Al-Baqarah, that God is not ashamed to strike a similitude even of a gnat. And this very small remark shows that the role of animals and their treatment has always interested Westerners as well. And we'll find in the course of the evening quite a few references where Goethe, the greatest of our German poets, has referred to Quranic or Sunnah teaching of animals. But animals are important. They are mentioned very frequently in the Quran, as you know, that God has every animal by his forelock. وَمَا مِن دَابَةٍ إِلَّا هُوَ آخِذُ بِنَاصِيَتِهَا. First of all, let us mention that the Arabs, as well as the Turks and the Persians, were interested in the animals to such an extent that, as all of us know, many of the famous animals have more than 100 names: the lion, the horse, and so on and so forth. And Mari has mentioned that anyone who doesn't know 70 names for a dog is himself not better than a dog. As for the animal fables, Kalila wa Dimna, which came from India and were translated in the 8th century by Ibn al-Muqaffa into Arabic, they have influenced not only Arabic, Persian, and Turkish literature, but were very soon brought over to Europe, and their stories have become commonplace in European literature up to the fables of the great French storyteller La Fontaine. And on the other hand, we should not forget that Qalila wa Dimna was often illustrated in the Islamic tradition. Some of the earliest Arabic miniature paintings from the 11th century are illustrations of these lovely stories of the two intelligent jackals. But it was not only the folk tales as they are maintained in Qalila wa Dimna, it's also the great poets of the Islamic world who have devoted their interest to animals. Let me just mention two of them. One is Shihabuddin Sheikh al-Ishraq, who was killed in 1191 in the city of Aleppo because his teachings, his mystical teachings, did not agree with common opinion. In his stories, he has taken Quranic allusions to animals and has elaborated them in wonderful way. For instance, in his story, Lughat al-Muran, the language of the ant, he has spoken about the simur, he has spoken about the bat and the lizard. In short, his little Persian stories are a treasure hole of beautiful animal stories. And even more, one of the greatest of the Persian poets has devoted his most famous book, the Mantiqutaya, to animals. Attar, that was the poet who died in Nishapur about 1220, has shown in this book the longing of the animals for a king and the birds for a king. We are going to speak of about birds somewhat later. All the birds are looking for a king, and the hudhud, known very well as a messenger bird between Sulaiman and the Queen of Sheba, lead them the way, a very difficult and hard way, through 7 valleys. And the Mantiqutaya is one of the most famous epics in the whole history of Islamic literature. It shows us the difficult road the soul birds have to go until they finally find their end, their fana, their annihilation in the divine word, the Simurg. But even more, In classical Arabic literature, as well as in Persian poetry, we find the theme of hunting. The Arabic taradiyat of the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries are famous. And we should not forget that paintings, pictures of animals, were very common, especially in Mughal India, when the Emperor Jahangir, who ruled between 1605 and 1627, had made portraits of all the interesting animals he knew from his kingdom, from Kashmir, the Punjab, and wherever his painters went. We have more than 100 animal portraits by the hand of his masters, Mansur and Abul Hassan, and we can clearly state that these are masterpieces which are useful even today for everyone who is interested in zoology, from the turkey to the zebra, from the grasshopper to the butterfly. Everything was portrayed by the court painters of Jahangir. And much more. We have, in the medieval Islamic world, handbooks of veterinary medicine, especially about horses and falcons, because they were needed, and some of them have also taken over into European literature. You know that the Emperor Frederick II of Sicily had translated the book of falconry from Arabic into Latin, and it was the basic book on falcons for many centuries. That brings us to books on animals. We know, all of you know, of course, the work of Al-Jahid, the work of Ibn Bakhdishu, and the work of Qazwini, Ajaib al-Makhlukat, and some of you may have also enjoyed my favorite book on animals, namely Ad-Damiri's Kitab Hayat al-Hayawan al-Kubra. Damiri, incidentally, a contemporary of the great Ibn Khaldun, has collected more than 1,900 stories and essays on animals, from the smallest one to the largest one. He gives their names in Arabic history. He gives stories about them. He tells what the Islamic law says about them, what their meaning in dreams is, and what their medical propensity is. And I think if any one of you should suffer under a cough in this terrible weather, he should or she should try Damiri's recipe against cough. Take the brains of a young gazelle, mix it with the fat of several mice, boil it, and mix it then with a broth made of cumin seed. I think if you think of it, your cough will stop immediately. But on a more serious level, we should not forget one of the finest philosophical works of early Islam, namely the book which is found in the Rasail al-Ikhwan al-Safa about man and animal before the king of jinns. There are an English translation by Leonard Goodman, a German one by Al-Maghize, and this book is one of the deepest thoughts about the relation of man and animal. All the animals come and claim their greatness. They show their qualities. They show what they can do and how wonderful they are. And the king of jinns listens to them carefully. And finally, there comes man. And although man is inferior in many respects to the animal, yet he has been blessed by God, who gave him the amana, and so despite his outward weakness, he is stronger spiritually than the animals, and is therefore their hero. Proverbs, of course, are filled with animal stories, and the mu'abbirun, the interpreters of dreams, have always shown an interest in the appearance of animals in the dreams. When you dream, for instance, that you overcome a very powerful animal or a terrible animal like a lion or a snake or so on, it shows that you can overcome your lower instincts or your bad qualities. And many animals, like nightingales, mean something beautiful. To see a nightingale in your dream means that you will have a beautiful son, and many other things. This is the topic of a large amount of literature. As I said, proverbs were common about animals, as in every other language. Comparisons with animals are very frequent, uglier than a monkey, and so on and so forth. Especially in the Maqamat al-Hariri, you find in the Maqama Tibriziya a whole page full of such comparisons when a gentleman or not so gentleman talks about his wife, comparing her to the ugliest and ghastliest creatures in the world. And the wife does the same about her husband. There is a special kind of literary form, the munadara, when two or more people, or in this case, kinds of animals, talk about their qualities and fight about the first place. This was a form of literature known from the Middle Ages, but it has continued in poetry and prose in all the Islamic languages to our day. I remind you only of a work of Amin Rihani, who takes up this kind of munadara in his book. And not to forget one of the most important aspects, the Sufi legends. The Sufis were always filled with love for animals. And the stories told by the great historians such as Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani or Atta show that the Sufis lived peacefully with the animals. One of them, Sahl Tustari, in the late 8th century, had even a Bayt Siba, a house for lions, where he kept wild animals to feed them. To feed animals is very natural, and the animals themselves take advice from the Sufis. They even sacrifice themselves for the Sufis. There are famous stories about a cat or a dog saving his owner from death, such as the pious cat of Ashraf Jahangir in northern India, who had been blessed by the great Sufi master by stroking about him, discovered something in the boiling rice pot and jumped into the rice. And they had to throw it out, and they found that at the bottom of the pot there was a poisonous snake. And the master said, "This cat has given her life for our life, so let's bury her." And he buried her and built a little mausoleum for her. This kind of stories is very frequent. It's not only the cat. We have very similar stories also of pious dogs. And the cats and dogs, once they live in the company of pious people, acquire some of their good qualities. And the Sufis, of course, never did any evil to the animals. In one of the works of Atta, we read that a Sufi, a proud one, went along his way, and a dog came close to him, and the Sufi threw a stone at him. And the dog went to the Sufi's master and complained. The master called the man and he said, "Why did you do that?" "This animal molested me," he said. But the dog said, "You see, I saw him in a Sufi's garment, so I thought no harm will come from him. If he had worn a soldier's garment, I would have feared from him, but not from a Sufi." And as a punishment for this misbehaving Sufi, the master ordered that he should never wear a Sufi gown again. And finally, we should also remember that many of the Sufis were vegetarians, because the animals loved them, since there came no smell of animal fat from their mouth and from their bodies. Stories which are known from the earliest time. Rabia, the famous woman mystic who died in 801 in Basra, was known and to be a vegetarian, and in many stories of later times this topic is touched very gently, because it's a question what to do with animals. Should we really treat them as something lowly? No, an animal should not be injured at all. Someone who injures an animal will be punished, as becomes clear from the story of Zamakhshari, the great commentator of the Quran, who died in 1143. He lost one of his feet. And when he was asked what happened to him, he said, "This is my mother's curse. When I was a young boy, I had a little bird, and the bird had caught his foot in the wall, and I took him out and I broke his foot. And my mother said, 'May God punish you the same way as you have tormented the poor bird.' And so I lost my foot because I had made a bird lose his foot." I think it's a very wise story, and one should keep it to mind. The Prophet has also spoken, as all of us know, against animal fights, which were so common in the Middle East. But unfortunately, this prohibition did not keep on. It was animal fights have been, especially in Muslim India, one of the great joys of the emperors, whether they put rams or elephants against each other. And it is a sad story that to this day, I saw it in Uzbekistan, they still use big rams to fight against each other. These are all a little muqaddimah, a little forward to some remarks about the individual animals. But I hope you see that the question of animal love and animal lore is common in all parts of Islamic literature, be it religious or frivolous. Every time the animals play a great role. In many cases, however, you will see that the same animal can be seen as something positive or as something negative. Something that is certainly negative is the ba'uda, the net with which we started our remarks, because after all, the net angers you, and yet it had a role in religious history, because, as all of you know, a net went into Nimrod's nose and destroyed his brain so that he died under terrible pains. This means the smallest animal and the smallest person can destroy the greatest tyrant. But I can't help reading to you a little verse which was written in Muslim India, in Delhi, around 1300, and which asks, "Who comes in every night close to my bed to wake me up with love songs in my bed? Is it my friend intending this or that? No, it's a net." Like the net, the flea has also a bad press, which is naturally, and we have even a book by Al-Ghumri in the 15th century in Egypt, who has written a risala to what extent fleas and lice in garments influence the ritual purity. It's a very important topic, of course. One of my German colleagues, the late Professor Littmann, has even published a lovely little book with the title Der orientalische Floh, the Oriental Flea, in which he has collected all kinds of stories and poems about fleas in Arabic literature. And after all, we should not forget that when some of the early Muslims complained of fleas, the Prophet is supposed to have admonished them, at least they wake you up for your prayers. Another creature that has a bad press is, of course, the fly. You can say he's prouder than a fly, but why? There is a story which has been told and retold in classical Arabic literature very often, a story of the Caliph al-Ma'mun and a Shafi'i. And Ma'mun was sitting on his throne and was molested by hundreds of flies. So he asked the great jurist, why has God created these terrible things? And a Shafi'i is supposed to have answered, Your Majesty, they were created to show that even kings cannot be perfectly happy, but have to deal with all these molestations by small things. And so Ma'mun said, okay, then I accept the flies. Flies, as I said, are considered to be very proud, and they can sit on kings without being chased away. But it can also be that they turn into examples of very stupid and proud people. A 16th century poet in India complains, stupidity has reached such a degree that every fly considered itself a huma, that is, a bird that gives you a kingdom. I think that these things happen sometimes even in the 20th century. But on the other hand, Persian poets always insisted that flies are found where you find sweets. And many of you may know the verse by Hafiz, which is perhaps not exactly according to Western taste. Is it amazing that your lover throng at your threshold? Wherever there is a place with sugar, there are flies. The spider is known from the Surah Al-Ankabut, where it is said that verily the frailest house is that of the spider, if they would only know. And the spider is therefore, in much of the literature, the example of a human being that strives, that wants to reach a goal, and just relies upon his own power, on his own breath, his own saliva. That is the general approach. However, we should never forget that it was also the spider who wove its net across the entrance of the cave where the Prophet and Abu Bakr were spending the night during the Hijrah. So the spider has a very useful work. And the Persian poetess Parveen Iktisami has written a beautiful poem by the title God's Weaver, in which she admonishes a lazy young man who ridiculed the spider. Why should this creature work all day? No one will buy the silk that it weaves, and every moment the spider web can be lost and destroyed. But Parveen reminds the young man very beautifully that the way how the spider weaves its net is a sign that he works for God's sake. God has given him the power to create something beautiful, even though it may not be useful at the first moment, and he should rather take an example from the spider and work even though at the moment he may not see a result. But it is God's will, and God's will is shown through the work of this lowly insect. It's, I think, one of the finest poems by Parveen Iktisami. But now to another animal that is again mentioned and proudly mentioned in the Quran, namely the Namla, the ant, in Surah 27, when Sulaiman came to the valley of the ant. The story of the tiny ant and the mighty Sulaiman is well known, and it is also well known that this poor, simple creature dared to bring Solomon a small gift, a locust's leg, as you still say in England. It is the ant who, as Damiri tells us, brought a lotus grain to Sulaiman, and when he looked at it and accepted this tiny gift, she said, don't you see us? We present to Allah what belongs to Him, and although it is from Him, yet He accepts it. And that, Damiri says, shows that the ants are an example of the most grateful people in the world. They give, they know that everything has been given by God, and yet they give it back to Him, sacrificing everything for Him. And the ant is also, which we would not expect, very strong. There is a story of a wise man who said to a king, "May God give you the strength of an ant." And the king was angry with him, understandably. Why should he be compared to such a small animal? And the man said, "Don't you see the ant? It can carry very, very heavy weight, much more than any human being can in relation to his body." And this is true. And so the ant often appears as something small which has amazing power if one only exerts this power. There are lovely stories in the works of Attar and also in the Arabic beautiful literature. On the other hand, it's again one of these cases where an animal has two sides. The ant becomes, in many traditions, an embodiment of greed because she collects food, brings it together, hoards it in her nests, and so is the example of the greedy person who thinks only of his own food and his own well-being. And so she is often contrasted with the birds, with the nightingale who sings all summer long, and in the fall she has nothing to eat because she forgot during her singing to collect some treasures. And the ant always appears as a preacher and that you should have worked and then you would have something to eat. This is a topic which you find very frequently, especially in Persian poetry, in Saadi, in Jami, and so on and so forth. And Attar also mentioned it a couple of times in his poetry. Much more positive, and only positive, is an insect which all of you know and which all of us love, the bee, the nahla, to which Surah 16 refers. And I think it is the animal that is praised most eloquently by the Quran. Even the word awha, Allah, is used, awha, a word which is usually restricted to the inspiration of the Prophet. It is the bee who brings you drinks of different colors and good for their health. This Quranic praise of the bee has always given this animal a very special place, so much so that even Al-Maqrizi, the great Egyptian historian, has written a special treatise about the bee. And a beautiful legend is found, I don't know if in the Arab world, but I know it from Turkey, from the poetry of Yunus Emre in the 14th century, and from Sindh in southern Pakistan, where it formed the topic of a lovely ballad. One day, the Prophet had some guests, and he had nothing to offer them with the dry bread. So a bee came and asked him to send Hazrat Ali with him, and the bee led Ali ibn Abi Talib to a tree where the beehive was. He took the honey and they went back, and everyone was amazed that this strange stuff was so sweet and so tasty. And the Prophet asked the bee, "How come this is so beautiful?" And the bee said, "You see, when we collect the fruit juice and we make it into honey, then we recite all the time the Salawat al-Sharifa over you, and by the Salawat al-Sharifa the honey becomes sweet." It's a beautiful story, And, of course, the Sindhi poet clothes his ballad with the admonition to all the Muslims, and especially the children, never to forget the Salawat al-Sharif, so that they also become as sweet as honey. And the humming of the bee is, of course, like the murmuring of a dhikr. The bee, as you know, had a big queen, which was called Ya'sub, and Ya'sub is explained in the Nahj al-Balagha that it is the mightiest lord, the one who rules people's affairs. The bees helped Ali in battle, so he is also called the Lord of the Bees. But the question of the Ya'sub is very interesting, because it's not only in the Islamic world that the leader of the bees, or the queen, has been considered to be a male leader before one knew it exactly. In Europe, up to the 17th century, the Ya'sub was also considered a male creature. It's an interesting parallel in development. And for the Sufis, the Pir, the Murshid, is the one who teaches the disciple the sweetness of the divine remembrance, and he is like the Ya'sub, like the great bee who brings happiness and beauty into one's life. Even mankind as such can be compared to a bee, namely a normal human being is, or should be, sweet, should produce sweetness, and should produce something useful, namely the wax. This is some thing that especially occurs in the works of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Sufi poet. But as much as we love the bee, and the study of bees is even today one of the central themes of some scholars in Germany, as much as we love the bee, as much do we hate her distant cousin, the wasp. Saadi, in the 13th century in Shiraz, says with full right, "True, a tyrant is just like a wasp, keeps you constantly in fear and dread. Wait until he's overcome one day, then you will put your foot upon his head. The tyrant can never last as little as can the wasp." And now we come to an animal which has a strange story in Islamic law, and which is, since olden times, since the days of ancient Greek, always considered a symbol of the soul. It is the butterfly, or the marr, the thrush. It is an animal which is flighty, which is confused, and when the Quran alludes to it, it is in the sense of confusion. And Imam Ghazali has a paragraph about the butterfly, or the moth, comparing this beautiful animal to persons who don't know where to go and just run around wayward and never find their real way. And this is exactly the contrary what one of the great Sufis said in his poetry. I refer here to the most classical piece about the moth, namely Halaj's Kitab al-Tawasin, where he describes in the Tasin al-Fahm the way of the moth that annihilates itself in the flame. It is one of the most beautiful pieces of Arabic prose, difficult to translate, and so I just want to read you a few lines out of it. It is a story of the butterfly who sees the candle from afar, and he comes closer, he feels the heat of the flame, and then finally he throws itself in the flame and turns into fire. For Halaj, this story is the symbol of the human soul who feels from very far the divine beloved. One sees him, one draws nearer, one feels the heat of the divine love, and finally one casts oneself into the fire. And I'll just read you the final sentences in the Arabic text. فحينئذ يصير متلاشيا متصاغرا متطائرا ويبقى بلا رسم وجسم واسم ووسم فبأي معنى يعود إلى الأشكال وبأي حال بعدما هذا صار من وصل إلى النظر استغنى عن الخبر ومن وصل إلى المنظور استغنى عن النظر. He who reaches the one whom he has seen don't need any seeing anymore. He is completely annihilated in the object of his longing. This piece by Hallaj has become a centerpiece of Persian and Turkish and Urdu poetry. In every poet's works you find the story of the Sham'u Parwana, the candle and the moth, and has become one of the most widespread images of the lover who throws himself into annihilation in order to become one with his beloved. The interesting part is that Goethe, whom I mentioned at the very beginning, has taken up this idea in his most famous poem called Selige Sehnsucht, a blessed longing, in which he speaks of the soul of the butterfly who undergoes this fate and who gains a new life by dying and again re-becoming, by fana and baqa, as the Sufis would say. And the interesting thing is that Goethe's poem starts with the admonition, don't tell the story, but to the wise, the understanding. And as all of you know, Hallaj was accused of ifsha al-sir, of divulging the secret of divine love, and that was one of the reasons for his execution. Goethe didn't know the story, but he intuitively understood it and understood the mystical meaning of the moth and the butterfly. And I think he would have agreed with a very little known poet from India in the 18th century who says, love is innate in a true lover's heart. The moth doesn't learn from any other how to burn. Iqbal has, of course, taken up the moth and the candle, but he very ingeniously has also made another comparison. He tells us in his Payam al-Mashriq, in his answer to Goethe's Divan, the story of the bookworm. And I hope I don't hurt the feeling of any of you when I say that the bookworm who complains to the reader that he lives in the pages of Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, but he really doesn't know what real life is. And then the butterfly comes and tells him, you have to burn in love, and then you know what life is. And the poor bookworm, of course, he had no chance to do so, but in any case, Iqbal tried to teach him that. And Iqbal has still, besides the butterfly, another animal which he loves. This is a firefly, the glowworm. Lahore, if any of you has visited Lahore in a summer day, it's full with fireflies, so that all the trees and the bushes are looking as if they were filled with diamonds. For Iqbal, the firefly is the ideal example of the man who has the fire of love in himself and can shine out of his own resources and thus show others the way. There is one more strange creature. I don't want to go into the whole serpent lore, but one creature I have to mention. This is the salamander. The salamander who is, according to popular belief, a bird. And he loves to live in the fire. So he becomes an example of the lover who lives always in the fire of love. But now let's turn to the real birds. You know that from the ancient times onward, in ancient Egypt and especially in ancient Greek, the soul was considered, if not a butterfly, then a bird. The soul bird is always present, and we still say, or at least used to say a few decades back in Turkey, when someone died, Can kuşu uçtu, his soul bird has flown away, a beautiful expression, which was also known in Arabic very frequently. So it is natural that birds play a particular role, and especially since Sulaiman knew the mantiqotaya, the language of the birds, he often appears as the master, the murshid, the sheikh, who teaches the birds and understands their secret language. For this reason, Attar, whom I mentioned already, has called his great epic the Mantiqotaya, because it tells the secrets of the soul birds. And before him, several poets and scholars had composed what they called Risalat al-Tayr, such as Ghazali, and Sanai, a forerunner of Attar, has in his divan a wonderful long poem called Tasbih al-Tuyur, in which he tries to interpret the sounds of the birds in a spiritual way. Every bird has his own language and, of course, expresses his own wishes and hopes in this language, and the poet tries to bring them to our understanding. That the birds praise God with their wings is known from Surah An-Nur, and in Surah Al-An'am the birds are compared to peoples. All these things shows that birds and people can be very well understood as similar to each other. To rescue the birds from the cage is a laudable act. It is often repeated that children in olden times used to take the birds and put them in a cage, but they were punished for that. And an early Arab poet has described the state of the lover, that he is like a little birdie in the hand of a child that molests it. So not a very happy state. The soul bird in the cage of the body is a common expression in all the Islamic literatures, and death is then, as we saw from this Turkish expression, the release of the soul from this cage. The most typical example of the soul birds is the nightingale, Andalib, or the bulbul. Why do you wail, O nightingale? This is a recurrent rhyme of one of the finest early Turkish poems, Niçin ağlarsın bülbül hey, by Yunus Emre, in which the complaint of the lonely nightingale is transformed into a lovely Turkish folk poem. And the complaint of the nightingale fill pages and pages, hundreds and thousands of verses of the poets in the Persian and Turkish and Indian world. All the more, and the word bulbul makes such a beautiful rhyme with gul, rose. That's why bulbul and gul, or bulbul and gul, can never be separated. And the wailing of the nightingale is part and parcel of the garden in spring, because then the bird dreams of the rose and can never reach it completely. Maulana Rumi said, therefore, for heaven's sake, don't talk about the rose, talk about the nightingale who is separated from his rose. It is the story of the nightingale who becomes only talkative when it is far away from the rose, because it can never be united with the flower. Even though the Turkish poet Fuzuli has written in a somewhat facetious way for the later summer days when the nightingales are quiet, perhaps the rose has married the nightingale for the sake of peace, because it's now hiding under a green veil. That is, in the late summer days, nightingales are quiet and there are no longer roses on the bush, so there may have been a more or less happy marriage between the two. But I think Fuzuli is the only poet, at least the only one I have found, who had this funny idea. Others may think that the rose takes the red petals and uses them as a handkerchief to wipe out the nightingale's tears. That's a quite nice idea, I would say. But usually the tenor is much more serious. O bud, are you the heart of the weeping nightingale? The rosebud looks like a bleeding heart of the unlucky bird. And the dew may be the tears of the nightingales. One could speak for hours about the story of the rose and nightingale, which again is of course the story of the longing soul for the eternal beauty of the rose. The rose is, as you all know, the manifestation of divine glory, and the nightingale, the complaining bird, just tries to reach it and knows it is impossible to reach this beauty. It's the eternal story of beauty and love. Another soul bird, which occurs again frequently, particularly in Persian poetry, is the falcon or the hawk, the baz or sakar or shahbaz. He is in a certain way even more typical for a soul bird, because as you know, young falcons are trained in a very hard way. They are put under a hood, and finally, when they have learned how to hunt, they are honored by sitting on the fist of the king or of the owner. This is exactly what happens to the soul. It is educated the hard way by the master until it has reached maturity. The Persian poets often have seen this development under the image of the nafs amara, which finally become the nafs mutma'inna, and then hear the call irji'i, come back, O soul at peace. This is for them the falcon who for a long time was lost from the arm of his master and finally returns in peace. Very often, both in Sohrawardi Sheikh al-Ishraq, whom I mentioned in the beginning, and in Rumi's poetry, we have dramatic stories how the young falcon is kept by an old woman, this is the world, who puts him in a cage or puts a hood over him and mistreats him in a very strange way, until finally, when the mistreatment becomes too bad, he remembered that one day he was a noble bird and he lived in the freedom, and then with great efforts he tries to reach back to his home, and finally when he returns to his master, he rubs his head on the master's breast and says, I have repented, and he is accepted in happiness and peace. So the soul falcon is a more powerful bird than a nightingale, but both of them represent the development of the soul, one of them languishing in love for the beauty, the other one being educated and striving very hard to come back to the original home. And in this respect, it's interesting that both Damiri and Attar and a number of other authors tell us a story of a meeting between a beautiful falcon and some chickens. The falcon accuses the chickens that they are faithless creatures. After all, the human beings feed them and look well after them, and yet the chickens always try to run away or to fly away. Why that? The falcon says, I serve them and I come always back, and why are you so mean? And the chicken answers, you have never been on the marketplace where hundreds of dead chickens are hanging by their feet, awaited to be eaten. So that's the chicken is, of course, not very frequently mentioned in poetry or in stories, but still there is one verse which I quote because Iqbal has made use of it. A 12th century poet in Iran has compared someone with very high and useless ideas to a chicken that has laid eggs without the help of a rooster, that is wind eggs. Iqbal has taken this verse and quotes it in the Payam Mashriq, applying it to, don't be shocked, to Hegel, the German philosopher. But what about the rooster? A white rooster is supposed to live in heaven, close to the divine throne, and when he starts crying, then all the animals on earth become quiet because they know the day of resurrection has begun. The rooster is certainly, with his quality as Abu Yaqzan, the father of awakeness, a good alarm clock in the morning, and the Mughal Emperor Humayun kept a rooster in the pantry of his palace so that he could awake the servants for morning prayer. And since he crows so early, he is also the enemy of the lovers who want to sleep a little bit longer, but are disturbed by the rooster. And all of you know the Indian miniatures which show a beautiful, loving couple on the balcony, and the man just tries to shoot an arrow at the rooster who has disturbed their loving encounter. But although the rooster is, on the whole, at least in higher literature, sacred, or at least semi-sacred animal, early Persian literature accuses him of leading a very immoral life, molesting so many hands at the same time, and some of the early poets wrote very rude language about the behavior of this rooster, who, as one of them said, is certainly not a good Muslim. And now we come to another bird who, at least in our Turkish tradition, is considered the pious bird par excellence. It is a stork. The stork is a Haji. Doesn't he look like a Haji in his beautiful white dress? And when he constantly says, luck, 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 which is, as all of us know, the sound of the stork, the Sufis, especially in Turkey and in Iran, have interpreted that as his word to God, al-mulk lak, al-hamd lak, al-izz lak. So the stork always repeats the praise of God, and besides, he dwells on minarets, so he must be a very pious bird. He brings the news from the beginning of spring. I remember once in Turkey, in central Anatolia, in the beginning of March, we saw hundreds and hundreds of storks coming from the south and then resting in the fields. It was an unforgettable beginning of the spring. And so one can say the enemy flees from a ruler just as the stork flees from the autumnal wind. When the autumn comes, the stork runs away. or flies away. So the stork, as a pious Haji, is a general picture, with one exception which I found, namely in northern Iraq, in Erbil, there is a story that the stork was once a man, a very obnoxious man, who made his maidservant climbing up a ladder, up and down and down and up, while she was wearing no underpants. And he was standing at the foot of the ladder and had a good time laughing and laughing and laughing at this view when he saw what he was not supposed to see. And so he was transformed into a stork. But this is the only negative story I have found about storks. But what about the pigeon, the lovely pigeon, the ringdove, which excels by its black feathers around the neck, the Taq al-Hamama, and all of you know that Ibn Hazm has called his beautiful book on love the Taq al-Hamama, because the thought of the beloved is as deeply ingrained in the heart of the lover as are the black feathers, the Taq or the Hamama around its neck. The Hamama, the pigeon or the dove in various shades, is always a loving bird. Early Arabic poetry has described how the lover listens to the cooing of the dove, and he doesn't understand it, but he knows that the animal is longing for someone just as he is longing for his beloved. Of course, it's also a letter carrier. The pigeon post was very active and very speedy in medieval Islamic countries, and it is, as all of you know, connected very intensely with Mecca, the Kabutar Haram, the pigeon of the sacred space. There is a constant feature in Persian and Turkish poetry. And in poetry, we can even have the idea that the gray doves fly around the great green cypress trees as if they were big butterflies flying around a candle. And when the lovers understood the words of the pigeon, it is not amazing, especially not in the Persian environment, because the constant cry of the dove, coo, 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 the cooing, means in Persian, where, where, where. So the dove, that's constantly, where is my beloved? The duck can be compared to a human being, half of it on earth, the other one in the water. And the goose, certainly not a very poetic bird, has at least been immortalized in one Turkish poem by Kaygusus Abdal, a Bektashi poet of the 15th century, for whom the goose is the example of the nafs, of the flesh, of the lower instincts, and he tries to get over them. And the refrain of his long poem, where he tells how he tries to cook this creature, is always, I cooked her 40 days, and yet she didn't get done. That is, even 40 days in the khalwa, in the seclusion, are not enough to make the nafs a little bit more palatable. Of course, there are birds who have a bad press. One is the owl, because she lives in ruins, and everyone who knows Persian poetry and Persian literature and Persian miniatures knows the story of the king Khosrow Anushirvan, who was a bad administrator, so that all the palaces and houses in his country were likely to fall to ruins. And a couple of owls was very happy about it, because now the father owl told his colleague he had a beautiful dowry for his daughter, all the ruined palaces. So he hoped that the ruler would live for a long time until everything was in ruins. And the negative aspects of the owl are, of course, very clearly indicated in the famous novel by Sadiq Hidayat, Ufkur, the Blind Owl, which was one of the great discoveries in modern Iran. And the same is true for the crow or the raven. The Quran tells us how the raven taught Cain to bury Abel, and the crow is a typical winter bird. When the nightingale, the pigeons, everything has disappeared, there are only these black, ugly birds who speak of sadness and can never enjoy anything. They don't know what roses are, they don't know anything. And if the crow knew of its own ugliness, it would melt like snow, as Ruby said. But already in classical Arabic, in pre-Islamic poetry, we meet the Ghurab al-Bayn, the raven that crooks, as a bad omen at the days of separation from the beloved. Strangely enough, the big crow, the very big one, are in Pakistan, especially in the province of Sindh, a messenger bird, like the pigeons in other parts of the Muslim world. And there are many beautiful poems where the loving girl says, "Quand cornichon carré, oh, you little darling crow, please bow down before my beloved. Oh, can't bring me some message from my beloved." But this is the only part of the Islamic world where I have found something positive about this bird. We mentioned already in the beginning the hudhud, the hoopoe, the messenger bird, Abul Akhbar, the go-between between Sulaiman and Bilqis, and as such he plays, of course, an enormous role in poetry, in love poetry, and it is a hudhud who comes to the birds to tell them that they need a king and that he would lead them. Thus says Attar, and it is the stories of the hudhud which lead the caravan of the birds to the end, to the goal, to the divine bird. Interestingly, again we have here also a negative aspect of the hudhud. In folk tradition, he is always called very dirty and stingy. I don't know why, but probably because he eats worms and other things, he has been called with very unpleasant names in the folk tradition. And as much as the ostrich is an interesting bird, yet his name in Turkish and in Persian, devekuşu and shuturmurk, respectively, means camel bird. That is, he is neither a bird nor a beast of burden, and many stories tell how he was asked to fly, and he said, "Oh, I can't, I'm a camel." And when he was asked to carry some load, "I can't, I'm a bird." So he is the example of persons who don't know how to behave, or rather who know very well how to forget all their duties and how to trick out people by saying, "I'm not this, I'm that." I think such devekushus are still in the world of today. And when the ostrich is a strange bird, then we come to two Indian birds. I mentioned some of them already in last year's lecture. One is a parrot, babagha in Arabic, the tuti in Persian and Turkish and the other language. For someone who comes from the European tradition, it is a very strange idea that the parrot should be called sugar chewing, because we don't like his sound, his voice so much. But for the Persian poets, he was a sweet-talking bird, especially the paroquet, the small green one, and the fact that he could be taught to speak made him a very interesting subject for the poets and the writers in general. He learns to speak, as one says, by being put before a mirror, and when he sees his own mirror picture and someone speaks behind the mirror, he thinks it is the bird in the mirror, and so he tries to imitate him. This is how parrots were told to speak. And I think this is an old-fashioned way, but for the Sufis especially, the parrot is someone who just tries to imitate the voice of the master and so on. It is, of course, a bird connected with paradise. He comes in his paradise-colored dress and is very wise because he has learned the speech of the master. But on the other hand, he is always against women. If you read the Tutti Name in various redactions, you will find that the parrot who watches the lonely woman in her house and sees that she has evil intention, but by his stories she is always kept at home and can never fulfill her evil intention to meet her friend. Yet, when the husband comes home, the parrot tells him that the woman had these intentions, and he did not say that she, after all, nolens volens, behaved, but the husband throws her out. And these stories that the parrot is an informant of the bad behavior of women is very common in the whole Indo-Muslim literature about parrots. And it is interesting, both in the Tutti Name by Nakhshabi, which was imitated so often in Iran and in Turkey, and also in other stories of parrots, it's always this negative aspect of his that is mentioned. But it's also worthy of mention that in an Ismaili book of the 16th century, in which a Hindu princess is supposed to accept Islam, the Hujjat al-Hind, the parrot instructs her in the Islamic doctrines, and especially he reads out to her one of the famous Sufi books, namely Najmuddin Daya's Mirsat al-Ibad. So it was a very learned parrot. But it is typical that the parrot very often appears as a teacher. And I mentioned, I think last time, that one of the finest stories in Rumi's Masnavi is the story of the parrot who was encaged and sent a message with his master to his relatives in India. And when one of them heard the story that his relative was encaged, he fell off, dropped off the tree, and seemed to be dead. And when the parrot was told this by his returning master, then he also dropped dead in his cage. But when the master threw him out, he flew away, and thus the master learned the secret of mutu qabla an tamutu, die before you die. It is by dying to this word that one can be revived again. So the parrot is the teacher of the real way as a Sufi or a human being has to behave, by dying to his own lowly qualities and by reviving on a higher level. And the second Indian bird is the peacock. The peacock, who has been praised in the Nahj al-Balagha because of his beauty, and who is difficult to find. Who wants to have a peacock has to endure the difficulties of the journey to India, as the proverb says. And yet it's interesting that in history, the Muslim rulers, both in Egypt and, of course, in Iran, had peacocks in their gardens. We know that the Tulunid Khomeravai kept a number of peacocks in his gardens, and so did the Syrian rulers of Aleppo, and of course the Abbasids in Baghdad. And that peacocks were kept in Indian houses as natural. After all, it is a bird sacred to Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom. But the peacock, again, has a twofold story. On the one hand, one admires him because he is so utterly beautiful. But on the other hand, according to legend, it was a peacock who took Satan in the form of a small snake into paradise, and thus Satan came to paradise. Therefore, the peacock has to be punished for his stupidity. Usually, he is admired, and yet there are always some doubts about his honesty. And Rumi has a very touching, moving story that the peacock tears out all his feathers because he doesn't want to be hunted and to be persecuted because of his beauty. He'd rather be a poor man without anything to be admired instead of praising his beauty and being praised for his beauty. To my feeling, the most beautiful Persian verse about a peacock is by Sadi, a verse which, to my feeling, expresses the dilemma of many people. He says, "In the eyes of men, my looks are beautiful, while I'm thinking of my hidden faults. Everyone praises the peacock's luster and color, while he is ashamed of his ugly feet." I think it's a very wise way how to behave. We come just to close the birds, to the legendary birds, the huma, whose shadow grants kingdom to those upon whom he falls, the simurg, the mysterious bird known from Persian poetry, first from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, but then especially in legends. The simurg is the mysterious bird who one of his feathers fell down in China. That is why China become the country of painting and of colors. And for this reason, so Attar says, the prophet says, seek wisdom even in China, because that's the country where the feather of Simurg has fallen down. And the Simurg is the final end of the journey of the birds in Attar's Mantrotaya. And Attar has invented the most ingenious pun of the Persian language. Out of the thousands of birds who start the journey through the 7 valleys, only 30 are left. Now 30 is in Persian si, and murg is the bird. And so when the 30 birds, the si, murg, reach the end of their journey, they discover that they themselves are the simurg. The individual souls are identical with the all-embracing divine soul. This is a message of Attar's Mantrotaya. And there is one creature of which one doesn't know whether it's a bird or another animal. There are many, many strange stories about it, although in Nahj al-Balagha it is praised and it is taken as a sign of God's creative power that he can produce something that looks like a bird and yet isn't got a bird. It is a khuffash, the bat. And in Persian poetry you find sometimes the idea that the khuffash is the creature that was fashioned by Jesus in the likeness of a bird from clay. So it's not a real bird, but it looks like a bird. On the whole, this poor khuffash has a very, very bad reputation in Arabic, Persian and Turkish literature, and of course in normal life too. The bat is the enemy of the sun. It can't stand the sun. It runs away, it persecutes other birds who live in the sun. Sohrawardi Maktoul has a number of beautiful stories of this kind. And so it becomes the embodiment of everything lowly, evil, unpleasant, and so on. In Arabic literature, we have one maqama by the 12th century Egyptian author Al-Wahrani. It is a risala of King Solomon to all the birds, where he tells them to get away, to kill all the bats. It is one of the funniest maqamas you can imagine, with all the qualities of a bat. It's not a bird. It behaves like a normal animal. It flies. It's ugly, and so on and so forth. It goes for over pages and pages, and finally he gives the order that everyone who has a garden or a piece of wood or so on should kill this awful creature. This is, of course, it reads very nicely, but it's sad to read that the poor bat has been persecuted so badly, and I think, at least I am quite happy that there is also at least one different approach to the bat, namely by Attar. Attar sees this poor animal, of course, as someone who shies away from the sun, but in one of his passages he has found the real reason, at least for a Sufi. The bat says, I don't like the sun, the created sun, the sun as Attar doesn't say it, but I may interpret it this way, the sun that belongs to the Afilin, to those that set. I am waiting in the night for the sun of midnight, for the real spiritual sun. This is my goal. So the bat is all of a sudden transformed in an animal that does not care for the worldly aspects of life, but is waiting that out of the darkness of life, all of a sudden, the sun of spiritual illumination will appear. And I think this is one of the finest verses by Attar. But with the bat, we have already left the birds and have come to the last category of animals, which, of course, are also mentioned in various forms in the Quran. And let me start with my favorite, with a cat which is, as Damiri says, a modest, tender-hearted animal. It's pure, as you know, a sacred animal. When it drinks out of some vessel with water, the water can still be used for ablution. So it has certainly an important role, and everyone knew that the Prophet was fond of cats. Now that is a hadith. I don't know if it's sahih, but it's beautiful. Hub al-hirra min al-iman. Love of cat is part of faith. But the most beautiful story of the cat related to the Prophet, you may know it, but I repeat it, it's found in some Persian sources. One day, the Prophet was sitting and a snake approached him and wanted to bite him. Abu Huraira went by, opened his bag and out jumped his cat and killed the snake. And then the Prophet touched the cat very gently, stroked her back, and that's why cats never fall on their back. And he put his blessed hands on the cat's forehead, and when you look at cats, you will find that almost everyone has 4 darker stripes here. This is a sign of the blessed hand of the Prophet. So you look at your cat and you will find it. It's a beautiful story, I think. And another story which is very, very touching and fits in very well in our topic about being kind to animals. The Sufi Shibli, who died in Baghdad in 945, was seen after his death in a dream, and he was asked, what did God do with you? And he told him that God forgave him and that God asked him, "Do you know why I forgave you?" And he enumerated all his religious duties, his numerous Hajj and prayer and zakat and what else. And God said, "No, not for these things have I forgiven you." One day, you remember, in Baghdad it was freezing cold and there was snow. And you went through the street and you saw a freezing little kitten on the wall. You put it under your coat and you saved it. Because you were merciful to this cat, I have been merciful to you. This story shows shows the depths of animal love in the classical tradition. And it is interesting to see that one of the begging orders in North Africa and Morocco, the Hadawa, had really sacred cats which they kept as a kind of company, and which were buried just like human beings. Of course, we can't deny that there are many other stories about cats as well. Everyone knows the story of the war between the cats and the mouse, a topic that goes back to ancient Egypt and has been elaborated time and again, most famously by Ubayd Zakani in 14th century Iran. It has often been illustrated, and many proverbs deal with the cat's greed and her hypocrisy. As they say in the Punjab, after the cat had eaten 70 mice, it went on to Hajj. And now our friend the dogs. Unfortunately, unclean, not like clean like the cat, but still they have a special place. They are mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf, وَكَلْبُهُمْ بَاسِطٌ ذِرَاعَيْهِ بِالْوَسِيدِ. The dog was stretching out his paws on the threshold. A beautiful story, and the dog of the seven sleepers, called in folk tradition Qitmir, has even been taken over by Goethe into his divan when he speaks about the animals that have gone to paradise, among them the little doggy who so faithfully slept along with the seven sleepers. And as much as the dogs have been despised and should be not allowed inside a house, yet they served as a model for many Sufis, because just because they were so lowly and yet so faithful, they formed a wonderful example for men. And in the 9th century, Imam Marzuban even wrote a book about the dogs who are preferable to many of those who walk around in clothes. It's a famous book about the dogs who are certainly much better than many people, a topic which incidentally occurs in poetry very frequently up to Muhammad Iqbal and up to modern Urdu poetry. It is always the dog, famous for his faithfulness, who can be considered an example for men. And it is interesting that the love of dogs becomes even more conspicuous in Iran, in Iranian texts. It may be that the old love for dogs, which is attested from Zoroastrianism, where the dog was a sacred animal, has persevered through the centuries to our day. And in Persian poetry, of course, you find all the different dogs, the dog that jump around through poetry as the dog of the beloved. You know the story that Majnun kissed the paw of a dog because the dog had visited the village of Layla. And so when you don't like a person, at least I know that from Pakistan, when you don't like a person, but you have to be kind to him because he is in some way related to your beloved, then you call him Saga Layla, Layla's dog. But the faithfulness of the dog is, of course, very often attested in names. such as in Iran, Qalb Ali, Ali's dog, and things like that. It is certainly an interesting topic that this twofold aspect of dogs, and if you read Attar's works, you'll find always that he takes the dog as a model for the behavior of man. And famous is, of course, the story of the immoral woman who went out and she saw a dog close to a water place, and he couldn't reach the water, but his tongue was hanging out from thirst. So she took her shoe and her shawl and made a rope out of the shawl, put the shoe into the water, and gave the dog to drink. And, so said the prophet, I saw her later in paradise. Even the most immoral person can be admitted to paradise when she is kind and helpful to an animal, even to a dog. It's one of the most touching stories in the early Islamic tradition. Of course, we can, after we have had the cat, we can have the mouse, who is usually a greedy person, and sometimes also a symbol of the lowly soul of the animal. But much more important are the big animals. Of course, everyone who speaks about animals or speaks about Arabia thinks of the Arabian horse, of its beauty, of its fleetness, of the enormous role it plays in classical poetry, all of in the mu'allaqat and so on. You find the wonderful descriptions of horses. But on the other hand, in Surah 38, Sulaiman is warned because of his exaggerated love of horse, and so he disables the horses who have taken him away from his worship. Yet, to look after horses beautifully is a duty for every believer. Folk tales tell that the Arab horse was created from the beautiful southerly wind, and as I said, descriptions of these horses in classical poetry are too many to be even mentioned. But there is one other aspect of the horse which is quite interesting. It is, in Persian poetry, the topic of the gift horse. Many of the poets from the 12th century onward complained that they were given by their patron a very old, ugly horse, and they describe it in the most ridiculous ways. This is a topos which goes on through the centuries, and one Persian poet, I remember, complains that he needs a little bit money to buy some fodder for his little horse, because otherwise it will starve on Eid Day, which was, of course, very sad. But something more. This miserable horse can become, in Sufi lore, also an image of the nafs amara. The Sufis, as you know, were not particularly interested in killing the nafs. They rather wanted to educate it, to train it, just like a restive horse is being trained by very hard means until it becomes a beautiful and obedient horse, a steed that brings you immediately to your goal. Thus, the human soul has to be trained and educated so that it can reach finally the goal, namely the presence of God. The education of this restive horse plays a great role in Sufi literature, but also in profane literature. And it is perhaps worthy of mention that the Aga Khan III, in the year 1899, issued a firman, an order, in which he uses this image in order to admonish the faithful Ismailis to educate themselves and to behave like good riders so that they may reach their spiritual goal. That is, this story has survived for more than 1,000 years in the speech of the religious people. But while the horse can be educated, the poor donkey is always in the bad books of the poets and the thinkers. The donkey whose voice is the ugliest of voices, and to whom we are compared when we don't understand what we read, كَمَثَلِ الْحِمَارِ يَحْمِلُ الْأَسْفَارِ. The donkey is again a nafs animal, but in a much cruder way than the horse. The horse can be educated and can turn into a most useful animal. The donkey can never do that. The donkey is the perfect personification of everything that's low in man, of greed, of appetite, of sexuality, and things like that. And even mystical poets like Rumi have described these poor donkeys in a language which is anything but noble, to put it mildly. And the stories of the sexual powers of the donkey are sometimes a little bit too open. But in any case, the donkey is, as I said, the image of the nafs, and Rumi has also one other image which is very funny. When he describes man, he says, man is a donkey to whose tail an angel's feathers were bound, so that the donkey, perhaps in the company of the angel, may be educated. So now we know what we are, a donkey with an angel's feathers. And one of the most important aspects of the donkey is, of course, its relation with Jesus. The donkey brings Jesus to Jerusalem, but it stays outside while Jesus goes up into the heavenly spheres. That is exactly, for the Sufis, the story of body and soul. The donkey is always the image, the symbol of the body, Jesus, the symbol of the pure soul. Camels, of course, come very frequently. We needn't go into the whole camel lore. That would be again a long talk from Arabic classical poetry onwards. But the Sufis also constantly spoke of the camel. And again, Rumi has certainly the most beautiful story when he speaks of human beings and their encounter with love. He says, when you make a den for your chicken, a camel cannot fit into it. He destroys the den. Thus, the body is a chicken and a chicken's den, but love is a great proud camel that doesn't fit into this den. A typical Rumi idea. And a camel always appears in a very positive sense in his way. And we should not forget that according to classical tradition, camels are very fond of music. They listen to their driver, and Siraj in the Kitab al-Lumma tells of a Bedouin who lost 99 camels because the driver was singing so beautiful that they came a distance of 3 days in one day, and then of course they all died on the spot. And this idea that the camel is fond of music and listens to his driver can also be taken in the spiritual sense. The soul listens to the sound of the divine voice. Nowadays it's difficult to speak about cows, but in any case we have Surah Al-Baqarah, and at the court of Emperor Akbar, in the religious meetings, it is told that one of the Hindus made the beautiful remark, God must have loved cows very much because he called the longest surah of the Quran after them. This is what Barauni tells in his chronicle of Emperor Akbar. And after all, the cows are not only mentioned there in Surah Al-Baqarah, but they are also mentioned for giving pure milk and useful things. The cow is there to be milked and to be eaten after all, if necessary, but one should not ride on a cow. There is a story that a cow complained to the Prophet that someone was riding on her back, and Rumi, practically minded as so often, reminds us that we should never want anything from anyone that's beyond his strength. You beat the cow when she refuses to carry the yoke, but not because she doesn't sprout wings. We needn't speak about the sheep, the lamb, the ram. They are all very well known. But the goat must be mentioned in passing, because the poets always know that the goat is useful, but it's not particularly intelligent. Man is not qualified by a long beard to become a qadi. Otherwise, the buck would be a first-class jurist. As for the jackal, we mentioned the jackals already in connection with Qalila wa Dimna, and in many cases it's substituted by the fox. The jackal is full of ruses. Jackal stories are very ludicrous and very amusing, and the most famous one is the one of the jackal who went to a dyer asking to be put into his vat and to be colored. And when he came out in a beautiful blue color, he claimed to be a peacock and expected all the other animals to greet him and to obey him. These stories go on, but it's always the attempt of someone lowly to show off in a way that one would not recognize him, but think he is the real ruler. And the same is true for the wolf. The wolf cannot be educated. He occurs very often in the Yusuf story, but the writers always admonish us that we can't change a person's or an animal's nature. As a Persian poet says to the wolf, "You grew up in our house, and yet you have eaten our lamb. Who told you that your father was a wolf?" And yet, even the wolf plays a role in the Qisas al-Anbiya. It was a wolf, just as it was a green lizard, who were among the first to acknowledge that Muhammad was the prophet. And so many people became believers. This is part of the beautiful stories from early Islamic days. And finally we come to the lion with its more than 100 names. The lion, the model of bravery. That's why Ali ibn Abi Talib was called Asadullah, God's lion, and often appears as Qadanfar or Haidar and Shir Ali in the nomenclature of the Shia countries. Lion is dangerous, and as Mutanabbi says, when the lion shows his teeth, don't think that the lion smiles. But on the other hand, the lion can be as mild and friendly as any other people, as any other animals. There is a beautiful story of a Sufi to whom a lion came with an inflamed paw. He had put a thorn in his paw, and so the Sufi took it out, and after some time the lion came and brought him some bread out of gratitude. Not to fear lions, this is the true sign of the man of God, because he who fears God doesn't fear anything, but everyone is obedient to him. And if the lion is the model of strength, then the gazelle is a model of beauty and tenderness. This beautiful, lovely creature is, of course, the name for the beloved everywhere in the Islamic world, but there is also a beautiful legend about a gazelle which has been retold in the Sindhi language many, many times. It is a story that a gazelle was caught in a trap, and the Prophet passed by, and the gazelle complained to him and said, "My two kids are thirsty and I would love to feed them." And the Prophet said, "I'll stay here in your place until you have fed your kids." And so he stood there until the hunter came and explained the story, and of course the gazelle came back with her kids to thank him, and the hunter accepted Islam, which is a very beautiful story, and it was loved in Sindh. I think I know 18 versions of this story. This gazelle, as beautiful and tender as it is, of course it suffers in this world. And one of the most touching stories in Rumi's Masnavi is the story of the gazelle who was captured and was put by the hunter into the donkey's stable. And none of the donkeys would believe that there was a beautiful country with fragrant flower where the gazelle had lived in freedom, and so it was her bad luck to be with the donkeys, the bad luck of all those who are spiritually interested in normal circumstances of life. And finally, we started with a gnat and we end with an elephant. Both of them are mentioned in the Quran, and we in Germany have an expression to make an elephant out of a net, which means exactly what you say here, to make a mountain out of a molehill. So the elephant mentioned in the Surah 105 has a long, long story as a war elephant, as something that looks like clouds, as the symbol of the divine which the blind people touch, and each of them touches only one part, the trunk, the tail, the leg, and everyone described the animal according to the part his hands have touched. It is exactly like trying to describe God from our restricted vision. No one knew how the whole elephant looked like. No one can say how God looks altogether. And the elephant becomes also a symbol of the soul. The elephant who dreams of India will tear his fetters and will run home into his homeland, just like the soul, once hit by the divine light, will leave this earthly world, will give up the fetters of this life, and will try to reach the eternal home. Thus, everyone, every animal in the world, from the gnat to the elephant, can serve for some purpose, can tell something about human behavior, can teach us how to look at them, can teach us kindness toward not only the animals but toward each other. And according to the folk tradition, the animals greet each other on Friday with the words salam, salam. And Abul Al-Amari has even claimed that animals come to paradise and that the animals will be recompensed for all the bad things, for all the suffering they have they have experienced here on earth. It's a lovely idea that the animals may, inshallah, share our paradise. But until this time, we should rely upon the conviction that no creature is there crawling on earth, but its provision rests on God. He knows his lodging place and his repository. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Annemarie. Who else can have this beautiful survey of animals in the way you did? You are a walking encyclopedia. I enjoyed myself tremendously, and I think everybody in the room. She was called by friends in her early life when she was in Turkey as Rabi'a, and Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, as you know. But now she calls herself as Hurayra. And that is the signature in the letters I'm gifted with when I get it, Hurayra. We appreciate very much and we thank you very much. This is a beautiful evening, and I'm sure what you have said will be printed, and it will be a real reference of Islamic literature. Thank you.